My name is Suhaimi. As Mark mentioned, I'm a member of the Charity Council. And I've also been lucky to be involved in the recent Transparency Framework Review Committee's work. It's a topic, transparency, it's a topic that doesn't require much introduction. Everyone knows generally what it's about. Okay. Hopefully it's better from here on. But yeah, I was mentioning transparency is something that we all know. It's something that doesn't require much introduction, but it is nonetheless a topic that is worth revisiting once in a while. So let's start, right at the beginning and ask ourselves why transparency is important. I'm trying to see, I'm supposed to move the slides now. Seems to be, but there are expectations. As mentioned before, we have a responsibility to perform a social good, and it doesn't just end there, right? Charities have to fulfill expectations entrusted upon them, and in so doing, they have to be, firstly, well-governed. Secondly, they have to inform stakeholders of what they're doing and how they're doing it. And thirdly, be accountable to stakeholders, okay? Let's imagine that I were to start a charity, right? And I told everyone I wanted to feed the poor, all right? I aim to ensure food security for every family in Singapore. And I raised a couple of $100,000, and why not? Singaporeans, corporations, donors, foundations, they're all happy to support this cause. Right? And this is just one of the many worthy causes out there. It could be many other things. But just imagine if a couple of months in, I decide to redeploy my resources to something else, environmental protection, promotion of the arts or sports, which are all worthy charitable causes, but different from what I started out with. Or what if I decided to procure food for the needy, but procuring it from, let's say, my brother's restaurant? Or what if it turns out that I'm paying my executive director a higher salary than the aggregate of the amount of money that I'm spending on feeding the poor? When all these things happen, of course, actually it does start to matter to donors, to foundations, whoever it is that's supporting the charity. It starts to matter what the details are, what you're doing. And it matters to them then, that you should have reported a lot of these things and been transparent from the very beginning. Now, as leaders and professionals, volunteers and donors to the charity sector, we all want the charity sector to be healthy, to do well. Now, what does this mean? Now, this means that we want charities to be well governed. We want donors to trust in charities and to continue to support charities' work so that we can all benefit society. And this is precisely why transparency is important, because governance is important. Transparency enables good governance. So transparency is a very powerful force, right? When consistently applied, it can safeguard charities against negative practices such as corruption and fraud. Secondly, through transparency, we can inform our stakeholders and empower them as well. So what do I mean? Inform is pretty sort of self-explanatory, but when you talk about empowering stakeholders, we have to imagine our stakeholders, particularly our donors, as people who want to give money for social good. But they have a variety of choices. There's so many charities out there. If you don't tell people what kind of good you're doing, what impact you're achieving, then you're not helping yourself. You need to empower stakeholders with information, data, stories, all sorts of things that can empower stakeholders to give more. So that's the second thing about transparency. The third thing about transparency is, of course, it keeps charities accountable. Through accountability, it builds trust. Because when you think about it, there is a symbiotic relationship between charities and the community. The charities want society to trust them so that we can spend the charitable dollars and the nation's resources. In order to do that, charities must strive to a high level of governance and accountability. So the ultimate benefit is an increased level of trust within the charity, in the charity, and within the whole sector. So those are the sort of main reasons why transparency are important. And I just want to take a look now at how the sector is faring in governance and transparency. So if you look at these, the bars on this chart. The blue ones are 2016 numbers and 2017 numbers in red. On the left, IPCs, on the right, non-IPCs, so charities which are not IPCs. So you can see here that obviously IPCs are doing really well in terms of their GEC submission, right? Their governance evaluation checklist submissions. 89.8% of IPCs submit their GECs in a timely manner in 2017. So close to 90%. So pretty good. And I think through the GEC, obviously you get a lot of transparency because charities are required to declare governance standards or compliance with governance standards. Compare that to non-IPC charities. So 54% of non-IPC charities submitted the GECs timely in 2017. That's just about more than half. And I think that's something that we can certainly hope to improve on. But nonetheless, you know, when you think about non-IPC charities, there's a whole spectrum of charities. We've got really small charities, medium-sized charities, and bigger charities. And we understand that obviously, you know, different charities have different resources, and the challenges may be more, maybe greater for smaller charities. But let's look then within these numbers at compliance levels. So IPCs and non-IPCs that submit their GECs, we looked at the numbers earlier, but within those, the number of those IPCs and non-IPC charities that actually meet 80% of the GEC requirements, right? Which means that, you know, based on their declarations, they are meeting the governance standards which are espoused in the Code of Governance. 89.53% out of the, you know, close to 90% just now of IPCs. And even amongst the non-IPC charities is 53.8% out of the close to 55%. So what this shows you is, firstly, there's a high level of compliance in terms of GEC submission on a timely basis, certainly amongst IPCs, and not too bad amongst non-IPC charities. And those who submit their GECs are doing fairly well, right? In terms of actual compliance with governance standards. What I want to impress upon here is if you're one of those IPCs that hasn't been doing it, it means that you're the odd one out. You know, you're sticking out like a sore thumb. And if your donors were minded, they could easily find this information online, publicly available, and see, hey, is this charity that I intend to donate to one that has been complying with GEC submissions? How is it faring? Now, over time, donors and all stakeholders are going to be more and more informed. They're going to look for information that's available, and they're going to make decisions based on that. So I think it's important to know where you stand. Okay, I'll move on now to talking about how we can improve on transparency. Now, it's not difficult to create a mindset of transparency and accountability. Indeed, many charities, as I mentioned, comply with GEC submission requirements and the majority of GEC standards. That includes transparency requirements. So it certainly can be done. So let's talk about how. We have today the Charity Transparency Framework, and as was mentioned earlier, we are in the process of revising, refining, and revamping a little bit of that. And the revised Charity Transparency Framework is going to be published next month in October. So this transparency framework was first rolled out 5 years ago in 2015. In 2019, we formed a subcommittee to review the framework's relevance and applicability to charities. And this process took about 1.5 years, with several rounds of feedback and discussions with charities and other stakeholders. So a big part of the review was to ensure that there was an alignment between the framework, the transparency framework, and the Code of Governance for Charities and IPCs, which was separately reissued or relaunched in 2017. And in addition to that, as part of this review, the committee wanted to ensure that we could identify what the sector considers to be essential disclosures. So what's important in terms of disclosures from the donor's point of view, from the regulator's point of view? We want to ensure that all that comes out in the scorecard that we're preparing to ensure transparency. We want to ensure as well that the disclosure requirements are easily achievable, right? So it's no point setting very, very high disclosure requirements or standards and no one can meet them. And what we've done here is to make sure that we've got a framework, a list of disclosure items that truly is easily achievable. And the third thing we wanted to ensure was to minimize duplication across sort of disclosure requirements. So if you're already required to report something or disclose something elsewhere, then, you know, the requirements should not be as burdensome, you know, or repetitive. So the idea of the transparency framework, we want it to be useful to charities. We want it to guide charities to think about transparency and to also act as a toolkit. So you can read through it as this is published, but essentially there is a scorecard there which allows you to sort of tick the box and say, well, am I meeting the standards or not? Now, in terms of outcomes, I mentioned just now, we want charities to understand transparency as a concept. We want them to know why and how to do it. We want charities to strive to improve. We want them to build capability within themselves, right? Build the transparency skills and ultimately good disclosure practices. And lastly, we want charities to be committed to transparency and accountability. So pretty simple stuff. Now, I mentioned some of this earlier. We conducted sessions with charities to gain feedback on the transparency framework, and we asked them what were the pain points, what could be improved. So all this feedback has fed into the framework that we've done. We think that it's going to be a framework that is achievable by all charities, even the small ones. We want to be clearer in terms of the expectations. So a lot of the disclosure requirements now have been refined so that it's very obvious and clear exactly what needs to be disclosed. Let me explain a little bit more on those 2 points. So the first point is a big change to how the transparency framework is designed. Lending or borrowing from the concept in the code, the Charity Code of Governance, we now tier disclosure requirements in the transparency framework, such that there is a basic category for small charities, an intermediate one for medium-sized charities, and charities that in the Code of Governance would be considered enhanced or advanced would now be in the large category. So 3 categories, pretty simple stuff. The tiering is similar to what you see in the Code of Governance. Let me give you an example. This is an item within the disclosure scorecard in the transparency framework, right? And it's one that covers board governance and executive management. So you can see here for basic charities, the small charities basically, very simple disclosures required, just the name of board members, the board appointments, date of appointments, and the frequency and attendance. Now the first 3, name, board appointment, date of appointment, that's the simplest stuff. Right? Almost all charities have that in their annual reports. Some charities struggle to have to include frequency and attendance at board meetings, but this is something that we think, well, firstly, all charities should have at their fingertips. I mean, they have that information and data because you would be tracking who shows up at your board meetings. And we also think, based on the feedback that's given to us by stakeholders, that this is fairly important, right? Because as donors and stakeholders, we want to know, right? The donors and stakeholders want to know whether the charity, no matter how small, whether it's well governed. And good governance is only possible with board members who are present and involved, committed to the cause. So this is one of the basic disclosure requirements that we've included for even the smallest charities. But if you move to the right, the middle category here, intermediate, medium categories, you'll see the list has grown. So in addition to the basic disclosures, we want them to disclose selection and recruitment policies for the board. Training and evaluation as well. And in addition to that, include a brief profile of the board members to talk about their past experiences. And this has been helpful to many stakeholders because people want to know as well, what's the quality of your board members? Are they really equipped with the right experience and skill sets to run the charity? And if you move then to the rightmost sector, rightmost column of enhanced and advanced charities, and this obviously applies to the largest charities and IPCs, then you have an additional disclosure item, right? You want a brief description of how performance is evaluated. Again, important for stakeholders to know. And the last one, in support of, I think, many of the points made earlier about sustainability, I think the community, donors, stakeholders, regulators want to know that there is renewal on the board, that there is succession planning. So the additional and last disclosure item is for charities to disclose or explain why there are board members who've been on the board for more than 10 consecutive years. So you can see here the main point. The Charity Transparency Framework in this revised format will now provide for different tiers for different sizes of charities, in recognition of the fact that smaller charities may not have the resources to disclose as much as the bigger ones, and also recognizing the fact that the bigger that you are as a charity in terms of donation, collection, and receipts, as well as expenditure, then you have greater responsibility, a higher disclosure threshold, more reporting to do. So that's how the framework is now going to be structured. I also mentioned another one of the considerations in the review process, excuse me. Another one of the considerations was to make things a lot clearer. So in the old framework, as an example, disclosure of information on the board, we required for charities to disclose terms of reference of board committees. And we got lots of feedback in this process, right? Charities were not sure. Does this requirement mean that charities have to, spell out their entire terms of reference? Some of these go into 3, 4 or longer pages, and it can be wordy. It's quite a lot. So in the new framework, we've sort of narrowed this down a little bit and said, look, what we need right now in this situation is just a disclosure of the brief description of the main terms of the terms of reference, right, for each committee. So we're talking about what's the purpose of the committee, what's its main responsibility, how many people are on the committee, stuff like that. So I think we're trying to be a bit more clear in terms of the requirements so that it's really easier for charities to meet the requirements. We've also made some adjustments to the charity transparency framework to ensure that it remains relevant, applicable, and useful to charities and stakeholders. So to the extent that there's information that was previously required in the old framework that is no longer thought to be important to stakeholders, we've taken it out. And this is one such example. So in the past, we had a requirement for medium and large charities to disclose how staff performance is reviewed and assessed. To be very clear, it remains important for charities to have a proper procedure, a proper process for reviewing, assessing, as well as rewarding their staff. But I think based on our consultations, donors, foundations, the stakeholders within the sector generally form the view that it's something we can leave to charities to sort out. And disclosure of this particular policy will not add very much. So we've taken that out of the framework. So hopefully, with all this in mind, the framework should be A, easier for everybody to adopt and achieve, B, clearer, easier for you again to provide the exact disclosure that's required, and thirdly, it will only be limited to disclosures that are important for the rest of the sector. Okay. This is now, a list of the disclosure areas within the charity transparency framework. So I don't think that this is going to be too alien to most of you. The disclosure areas mirror the areas within the Code of Governance. So governance standards backed up by disclosure requirements. I'm sure some of you will look at this and say, some of these categories are probably easier than others. And I think it's a good opportunity for you to perhaps ask the panel members a little later on about some of these categories and where you faced difficulties in the past. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this because the charity transparency framework has not been released yet. It is going to be released again next month. But again, so these are the 9 key areas of disclosure. These are the things that will give the public and other stakeholders a meaningful understanding of the charity's work and how it's managed and governed. So that's the end of my presentation proper.